if you task the art sector with how to make messages not about the crisis, but on the shifts in behavior that are necessary on a more meaningful basis. When the pandemic began and we had certain products weren't on the shelves at grocery stores, but there was still lots of stuff. There was shortages, but there wasn't that much shortage. How much would my life really change if half the products in the store were just not here? Right? And half of them didn't come from all over in the world. Like they were just, whatever made sense to have it available here, and just having less choice. Like how terrible would that be? I'm like, kind of not. How can we just change behavior on a more holistic level and have it stick? Because that's what we need to do right now. And I think the arts would be a great vehicle to see that those messages really hit everybody and make a change.
Another episode of the Conscient Podcast. I'm with Clayton Windatt, who will introduce himself in just a second. I've known Clayton for a long time. When I was at Canada Council, he's an advocate for all kinds of artistic activities, but he's also a creator and wears many hats. And so I'm really happy that you're here, that we can have this conversation. So maybe we can just start and introduce yourself, Clayton, and then we'll take it from there.
Hi, my name is Clayton Windatt. I am a mixed blood settler Métis person, non-gendered, living here in Sturgeon Falls, Ontario, Nipissing First Nations territory. I am an artist, a curator, and an arts enthusiast that pursues my world from the position of unrest. So that often leads to advocacy or all kinds of arts message making, either through arts practice or through arts policy.
Well, I saw your website. The subtitle is Make Things Happen. And that's certainly been my experience with you. You're somebody who takes the bull by the horns, so to speak. So let's start with the question I've asked everyone so far in this season, which is about the notion of reality, which is a very broad topic, the relationship to reality and denial, but also just how the different worldviews around reality. How does that? How do you respond to that? The notion of reality.
I think it's really great to ask questions that aspire big thinking, and that idea of consciousness, like the being aware of the various things that are impacting us. I think it's very easy to deny, and that especially in a world where the majority of our interactions are now all through screens, that it's really easy to think about it as not having a direct impact on you as an individual. So my reality is trying to think about the world and how we as a generation, or many generations alive right now, can be making offerings that will be benefited by future generations. So the idea that it isn't like, I know that sometimes my term usage can become a little conflicting, but at the same time, like, almost, I know I don't want to think about things as being broken and how they can be fixed. Obviously, I think that is a reality for some people, but I think about it being, it's not as simple as that. It's more, how are we working as hard as we can in the hopes that it will be better. And it isn't as simple as letting yourself off the hook emotionally by saying, well, I did everything, it's fixed. And I'm like, you don't even know everything. How could you assume it's fixed? So we have to think about ourselves being like, how are we putting in maximum effort ongoing, and let other generations down the path decide whether that was enough.
Writer Rebecca Solnit. Hope locates itself in the premises that we don't know what will happen, and that in the spaciousness of uncertainty is room to act. And what about the notion of ecological grief? It's certainly something that I've experienced bodily. How do you relate to that?
Yeah, I mean that's there's so much there to unpack. I mean, I do think about how to contribute towards solutions or towards making things better, as opposed to being part of, you know, contributing towards pollution or ecological disasters, which I think we're in the middle of so many disasters, and it is a crisis, which I mean, that definitely those terms will cause grief. But I also think there's a lot of how do I say this? Like denial breeds sort of this idea that we can't be comfortable. And I say we also cannot be comfortable, but you need to get used to the idea that discomfort is part of life. So the idea that denial was part of a way to be able to be comfortable or to allow you to relax, and I'm like, we were never supposed to relax. We were supposed to be stewards of the land, take care of things, nurture growth. I feel like the idea of I don't want to call it laziness, but there is this part of me that thinks that part of the reason why we deny problems or the wrongdoing of others and try to ignore it is that it's a lot to take on and it adds stress to our lives, and all of a sudden we're very distraught over things that we feel we have no control over. But that place is a place that many people live all the time, and they've become accustomed to being like, I know that things are terrible, that's why I work this hard.
Well, maybe you could talk a bit about your art practice and some of your activities in the artistic community. You can start at any point because they're probably all interconnected, I would think, Clayton.
Oh, I love that. They are very interconnected. I mean, I think I'll start where I am now, which is I'm currently working as the artistic director of ARCA, the Artist Run Centers and Collectives Conference, which is a national organization dedicated towards the support of artist run centers and the 180 plus arts organizations that identify as artist run center. And then, if we move back prior to this role, I was working with at the time called the Aboriginal Curatorial Collective, now called the Indigenous Curatorial Collective. And before that, worked within the Whitewater Gallery, which was an artist run center in North Bay, which is close to where I live. And that whole time, pursuing my own practice as a thinker and an artist that goes between many genres, specifically performance art and curatorial practices, usually with curating my own work, but sometimes with others or for others. And for me, art is the way to get a message across and to communicate. So, sometimes when I'm communicating may be very personal and not quite obvious what I'm trying to say. Other times it's very direct, and it could be, text-based messaging within a video to provoke a response. So it goes across the spectrum. And I think that the arts organizations I've worked with have been sharing in those message makings, like being like, how can we communicate effectively the needs for change or the supports that people could access to help them have that kind of foundation within their world, and then be those instruments of change themselves, right? So there's a lot there. Yeah.
Well, maybe we could talk a bit about art and climate change because that's a topic that I've been exploring. But in fact, it's art and the larger ecological crisis that's the real topic. And if you want to go even broader, it's some of the systems that we've built that are destructive. So, what have you done in terms of art practice, and also more broadly, where do you think needs to be done by the artistic community as a whole?
That's such a great and expansive question. I mean, I think, like, I'll try to start with the way you've presented it, like with my own work. And there are things that are simple, like saying, I'm going to make something as an artist. I'm going to go and fabricate something. And there's small ways of saying, well, I'm just not going to use materials that I know are detrimental. And that's a very minor self-choice, but it is something that I think has directed my practice. I mean, like I years ago used to work heavily with like urethane rubbers and plastics and make toys, and this was like an obsession. I loved this, but I just couldn't produce things and feel like this is just going to be in a landfill and this is just going to be thrown away, or I'm just creating more consumption, right? So how do you respond to that conflict of like loving something and but then also feeling like it's just part of this problem? Well, it's like, well, maybe putting effort into like saying I'm going to make uh, wood-based products and not load them with varnish and things that are detrimental. Instead, I'll make them out of raw materials. And then, well, what happens when they get thrown out? I'm like, well, 1 year later, they're just a pile of dirt that is completely where it came from, right? So like, there's this idea of like, we don't have to make things permanent. And for a while, I pitched different public art commissions. As an artist, we respond to these different things. And for the longest time, I had this project where I wanted to make these flower beds that were going to be made entirely out of raw wood. And when you're pitching to a public art commission, it's like usually it's like there's a certain level of like permanency, right? This is like something that a community is saying they're going to take on, and it becomes almost like a heritage site. Like they have to maintain it. That's part of the structure. So when you're pitching saying I want you to make flower beds out of raw wood, which basically either has to be replaced or maintained very frequently by the community, or 5 years later that is just going to be a mound of random and locally indigenous wildflowers. um, that's not really very attractive when people are thinking like, well, how come this isn't made out of concrete and cast steel or whatever? And I'm like, well, because I don't want to make something permanent. I want to make it that you either love it and you take care of it, or you're not making it a future generation's problem. And this became how I started adapting my thinking process to be like how temporary could or would be something that could be permanent, but it has to have that idea of effort and generational transition in order for it to be cared for in that way. And then flashing forward to today, having conversations, with various architecture groups or policymakers, seeing how those discussions are starting to enter into those spaces without my involvement, because other people are thinking those same things of being like, why would I want to create something that future generations just have to deal with? Like they should want to deal with it, but we don't know what they want. So how can we make it that we're not locking them into having to deal with this? Instead, it's like they either cherish it and they celebrate it, or they decide it's not for them and they're able to move on, and it isn't a massive environmental mess. I mean, I think about it as well, like when it comes to like the organizational side of some of the shifts being really like how gallery culture in general has started looking itself more as like community hub and artist culture of coming together. Like artist run culture is shifting heavily towards sort of like the more value based systems that I think artist run culture was initially started within the 70s. Like the idea of it being like a movement that you're part of, supporting each other towards shared goals, and kind of activating through that community. And I think about it being like, when I think about environmental stewardship, there's more projects that I'm watching coming out of artist run culture in regards to that than maybe exhibitions that are directly responding to climate crisis. Like it's one thing to showcase photos of something horrible, but it's another thing to be like, instead of that, we're actually going to go and clean up our own waterfront, and be more action driven and fixated on it. And I'm not trying to say one is better than the other, but I am seeing much more movement within these structures in that way of being like less subject driven and more personally accountable and community driven. Yeah.
And more of a process of engagement on the long term, as opposed to a one-off. These are my feelings about something, but this is my actual commitment to the issue, which is a permanent issue, unfortunately, because of what we've done to ourselves.
Well, and it's that idea of it can't be transactional the way I was saying earlier. Like it's not broken and then fixed. It's relational, which means that whatever effort you're doing, we have to then circle back and continue to maintain that relationship. Like so, if you want the waterfront to be clean, we go and we volunteer at the waterfront. But you don't do it one day and then pat yourself on the back and say done. You have to go back a couple of weeks later and check again, and you have to keep maintaining this whole level. And only through that effort on a bigger community level do we see other people really start buying into it. I think that idea of checking a box lets so many people off the hook. And I think specifically about a long time ago, a friend of mine went on one of those rants about Earth Day, and they were like, you have to turn off your light at this time of night, and everyone's going to have their light off. It's a symbolic gesture, and they didn't turn their light off, and they're a little older and a little grumpier. But when the people in the neighborhood came to kind of lecture them, they're like, I have my lights on from 7 until 9 only, at all, ever. I watch you all leaving your lights on all the time outside your house all night on this whole block. I am not interested in you lecturing me. Earth Day, that's great, but I practice Earth Day every day. And I don't need to practice Earth Day because you're the ones that need this simple gesture to make yourselves feel better.
Well, Clayton, yes, and sometimes the criticality of a look at a one-off as opposed to and this is where the arts are really interesting, right? Because artists have been working on these issues forever, right? They're always raising social issues and awareness, but we're at a phase now where we're beyond the sort of awareness phase. We're into we need to act very quickly and effectively. And so what I'm seeing is artists organizing themselves, some panicking, which is not good, others underinformed, which is also not good. But all those things can be corrected by not only leadership but solidarity. It's like we're all in this together. There are some paths forward for future generations, and let's get on with it. Let's make things happen, as you would say. What about the arts? Like, what are some of the barriers now in the arts community? I mean, it might be funding, it might be systems, but I mean, for those artists who want to get more involved, and then eventually, I think everyone's going to have to be involved because of the nature of the crisis. What are some of the barriers and opportunities for the arts and cultural sector?
Well, I mean, there's lots. Some of them are self-imposed barriers. I mean, the competitive nature of art systems in Canada make it that we are constantly sort of increasing the scope of our own actions to remain competitive, and there's that idea of being applying for things and having to secure funding makes it that there's sort of a constant amount of sort of negotiating. It's not like this is you don't hear places say, well, these are our two staff and we don't ever need anything more than this. They're always sort of this fluctuation, and I mean there's a few exceptions, but that idea of competitive nature sort of uh, breeds unrest. And I say unrest, I'm not upset about unrest, but I am upset by the idea that they're constantly pursuing the rationalization of their own existence instead of having time to be able to think about all these other things that they should be thinking about, right? So there's a bit of like a an organizational climate of sort of crisis, and I think that even when the Canada Council for the Arts doubled their funding budgets and said things like, I want to hear how you would use increases to stabilize staff, secure your operations. I could almost guarantee that a large majority of applications came in saying how much more they were going to do with the money, because that's the climate we're in, like this environment of of competition kind of makes you nervous that even if everyone else says, no, we're just going to stabilize ourselves, they don't trust each other enough to actually be the one who says, well, I'm just going to take more money to stabilize, because they think everyone else is going to say, well, actually, I'll do double what they do. And they'll be the it has that feel, right? So there's the lack of stability for their ongoing infrastructure, um, is kind of keeps it precarious, right? And I think that when I talk about precarity, there's lots of advocates out there, especially within the basic income movement, that use that term very often about the arts. But going more to the barriers for the art sector in general, like I think about it being how those spaces just having certain things kind of taken off the table to worry about would allow them to start making more holistic community offerings, like maybe not global offerings, but at the same time, like these are rally points for people who are very deep thinkers, like and the idea that the arts sector in general, should be compartmentalized away from like larger global issues. I'm like, I don't agree with that at all. I was extremely happy to see the new Minister of Canadian Heritage bringing their environmental issues and like the idea of environmentalism and land stewardship into Canadian heritage and start talking about it. I know that there are some that were like maybe off-put, saying I don't know why that would be talked about there, but I absolutely agreed with it being talked about there. The cultural sector, like the arts sector, is probably the place where the most critical discourse in relation to subjects can happen in a non-aggressive, non-violent way. The idea that they're really critical subjects can be explored and shared within the public. Like that's one of the few places where that can happen without it leading to like, pointing and yelling and shoving desks and all that kind of stuff. Like we can have huge differences of opinions that result in being able to have the people witnessing it understand and maybe even just have consensus. They don't have to be on one side or the other, but they can understand both sides of it. Like that's what I think the arts can do, like that power of the arts idea. But going into like the idea of what they can do in the arts and the barriers, I mean, like I think about how if you task the arts sector with how to make messages not about the crisis, but on the shifts in behavior that are necessary on a more meaningful basis, right? So the idea of like um, when the pandemic began and we had you know, certain products weren't on the shelves at grocery stores, right? But there was still lots of stuff. There was shortages, but there wasn't that much shortage. And I thought about it going, how much would my life really change if half the products in the store were just not here? Right. And half of them didn't come from all over in the world. Like they were just, whatever made sense to have it available here and just having less choice. Like how terrible would that be? I'm like, kind of not. But what would be the larger outcome? I'm like, well, you'd have radically less waste from, products that are put on the shelves and aren't purchased that are later thrown out. You'd have radically less carbon because we're shipping half of the amount of things all over the world, and maybe these are the kind of conversations where, similar to more advocacy specific messages saying, you should eat less fish because of the fishing industry's problem, like causing all these plastics in the ocean, and these other initiatives of like animal rights. Um, that's a very specific message, but maybe there's things where it's like, well, maybe we should just be focusing on consuming less. And I know that that's hard for governments to do, but scaling things down, if they look at it in a way of planned scale backs, they don't have to be thinking about oh yeah, it'll result in massive layoffs and there'll be so much less. There'll be less money, so you'll be hiring less people and they'll need less. You'll just have smaller. It's not worse. It's actually possibly the only way that we'll survive.
But the quality of life can be excellent in terms of human relations and culture and local ecologies that are rewilded and regenerated. There's lots there that we, depending on where you live, but everywhere where someone lives, there's the potential to enrich the life in those ways without growth.
Well, and like thinking about the quality of life and the standard of living and these kind of terms that are like the definition of like standards of how people can have like, some form of prosperity and existence. I almost feel like the recontextualization of those standards into a term like that would be, saying like what neo cohabitation looks like, like whatever that is. I think it could be very valuable because just that idea of the shift of terms and what they're supposed to mean allow bigger narratives to be built. And there's so many people trying to just make their homes more livable and less cluttered piles of things. And the idea of what life looks like, I think, is changing. I think that as much as the pandemic has been absolutely horrible and a massive amount of losses, um, a crisis of this scope has made it that certain things cannot be denied anymore. We there's just too much put directly in front of people that is forcing them to address certain aspects of life. That's hopefully going to become something that we can build upon to be like, so now that everyone realizes that they don't have to get on a plane and fly all over the world in order to go to meetings, maybe there'll be less flights. We'll travel when it's really important for us, but I don't I in the arts, I remember on an average, when I was very busy working within these roles, I would probably go to approximately 10 to 15 conferences a year. And those are flights all over the country all the time. Moving forward, I would be surprised if I went to one a year, in person. Maybe one. But I just don't feel the impulse to travel at that level. And I think that's a good thing. Like I'm happy with that as an outcome of all this, even though, again, the loss is unbearable.
Yeah, well, there's a crisis is a moment to reflect or not. In this case, it is because of the nature of the crisis, but it's a crisis that's leading to other crises that will be larger, unfortunately. But I appreciate your thoughts on all of this, Clayton, and I wanted to maybe end with a bit of a discussion about Indigenous arts and culture and how Indigenous arts communities relate to the notion of the climate crisis, because I assume there's a different worldview there.
Oh, there's absolutely many worldviews there. I mean, every indigenous community, has their own cultures and customs, and at times, languages and you know varying viewpoints, which is also why it's been so hard over the last few decades, where one person will say, "Oh, well, this band's actually in favor of this pipeline," and I'm like, "Well, what does that have to do with anything?" Like that's like saying one mayor is in charge of or is in favor of a pipeline, but another one isn't. Like that one mayor doesn't speak on behalf of all the mayors. So like that, those comments always come across as strange, but it's really more been the realization at how little many people even understand about various indigenous groups and how different each of them can be. I mean, I think about how land stewardship has become more and more talked about, especially in regards to urban planning and relationships with Indigenous nations are becoming more than the token consultations that I think have happened in the past. And I say token meaning, I've never had any firm definition of what Indigenous consultation means. So there's a part of me that you watch a group come in, say this is to talk about this environmental issue happening to your region, and this is a consultation. And you go, okay, well, we don't want you to do what you're doing because we actually care about this place. And they say, oh, well, we've heard you, thank you, and that was the consultation, and they move forward. They don't have to hear you say no, and that really bothers me. Like the consultation should be, you have to convince us to say yes. Right? Like it's not just talking and then that's it. Like what's the point then? It's just lip service, you know. So seeing the things like land stewardship and more meaningful relationships go to places that are about accountability in a bigger sense than, you know, one handshake or one photo op. That's really gives me a lot of hope. And you know, I am upset to say that I only see that once in a while. It's not the norm. But you know, I'm gonna try to stay optimistic, and I'm gonna say, you know, the times that I see it, the people that get enthusiastic towards the idea of people working alongside each other and making it make sense and making it work in a mutual benefit for both sides of the two communities or the many communities that we're talking about. Um, you know, hopefully that gets more and more and more commonplace. At which point, you know, whatever terms or whatever new ways that takes shape, because you know, I think that although obviously everybody's been living together for generations, uh, it's I can't remember who said this. I want to say who originally quoted it, but I remember it was J.P. Longboat who actually said it in front of me. But I just can't remember who J.P. was quoting. But they said, you know, it's been 7 generations of this. So you want to know how things are going? Well, why don't you try doing better for 7 generations and then ask me? You know, like it's got to be that way.
Well, in the reality podcast, I tell a story about how and a representative from an indigenous organization was talking about that it would take us long to fix or to change back or to change to healthy environment, the damage that has been done.
That it would likely take as long to resolve the ecological crisis as it did to create it. Now, I played this back in my mind. Take as long to resolve the ecological crisis as it did or as it does to create it. How is this possible? And then I said, but we don't have that kind of time. Or do we? We all looked at each other in silence.
And the notion of time is relative, right? Because we have to do everything we can, but we have to do it well. We have to do it with every bit of integrity that we have, and we have to change. We have to re-educate ourselves. That's what I'm trying to do with this podcast: re-educate myself and those who are interested. And so I've been listening to you for years because I think you're a truth speaker. You know, you never hesitate to say what you think needs to be heard. And so I appreciate that, and I hope you continue to speak, you know, in that way, because it's very much appreciated.
Well, thank you. And one thing I'll say is that in that same way of sort of unlearning things right now, there's always discussions about, you know, like the difference between a group being autonomous over beside, you know, a government or you know, an organization, and then the difference between having them work within it. And one, you know, and it's a conversation about, you know, whether assimilation is happening. And so like right now, when we say like, you know, what are the big changes, you know, I'm not expecting the government of Canada, you know, maybe even within my lifetime, to start talking about how they are going to be co-leading this landmass with Indigenous peoples, how like leadership would be shared at that capacity. But I do think that the conversations we have now could open the next generation to those things. And that's really that, again, like I really get optimistic and hope that that's what comes next.
Journalist Richard Heinberg. Hope is not just an expectation of better times. It is an active attitude, a determination to achieve the best possible outcome, regardless of the challenges one is facing.
So like, especially when I'm thinking about, you know, like the structure of changing things within the arts, like I, you know, like I was about to say how much I think like the monitoring of, say, jobs as an economic benefit, like a waypoint for the economy, um, it's like artificially created. So like there's so many jobs that the government like creates just to, like for not-for-profit purposes, like Canada, like, and I'm not complaining about Canada Summer Jobs as a training initiative for emerging, professionals coming into things, but it is 100% funded by government, and it comes at strategic times to boost numbers. So when they say, "Oh, did you know that a million jobs were created this month in the province of Ontario?" And I'm like, "Well, of course they were. They're all funded by this initiative. Like that's not, those jobs won't be there later. Like it's ridiculous that you're saying that." But also like the fluctuation and kind of meddling of this system in order to have this benefit. And then at the same time as I'm complaining about that, I'm struggling so hard to have different structures within the arts established so that the jobs of arts and culture workers can be monitored and be actually identified as an industry, so that we stop becoming like little more than a bargaining chip during elections. That the value of that sector is more tangible beyond the artistic outcomes. And the reasons why I say all of these things is that, like when the Canada Council had its funding doubled, everyone was like, "Oh, great!" And I'm like, "Now tell me what that does. Like, does that create jobs? Like, do we even know?" Right? Like, there's no defined industry here or set group of people that are employed. So there's no, wage benefits or salary expectations or sort of like standards of living. Like it's just sort of ambiguous, and that competition kind of keeps us in that place. But like, so this idea of imagining places where you know having a job isn't the measure of success. The outcomes themselves, the arts already focus on those as the measure of success. And even though I am pushing to have that infrastructure there to make it that, advocates could start focusing a little bit more on advocating for specific art or ideas within art, and less about how art should or should not even be allowed to happen, which I think that the majority of advocates are actually fighting to have it that they can be at all, not really what they're doing. I would love for it to shift to be like that in general, instead of saying that jobs exist and I'm fighting to have our sector identified as an actual sector, that it's like, well, actually I'm doing the opposite. I'm having it that all of the having jobs exist isn't what's valued. The outcomes are. So why are you saying that there's all these people doing this just to do what? Just to make plastics that are inevitably going to trade hands 15 times and then be in a landfill, and then you'll pay that same workforce again to go and what, try to get them out of the landfill. Like, why are we doing that, right? But if we were talking about why are you doing these artistic messages, I don't think it would have to be as hard to sell. So maybe I should take my own advice and actually be fighting to have the economic benchmarks be changed, and instead of fighting to have the arts considered as one of those economic benchmarks.
No, it's a good point, and I think new economic models are on the horizon. We don't know exactly which ones will stick, but the old systems are falling apart. They're literally falling apart, and so new models have to come in that are vastly better for people, as opposed to. I mean, I had a conversation with Jennifer Abbott, who's one of the co-directors of the Corporation film. There was in
Yeah, so I love that film.
yeah, and they're really important work, right? They identified probably the biggest problem we have, which is that these massive corporations are out of control. And whether you're capitalist or not, there's versions of capitalism that are, conceivably okay, but it's that kind of corporate structure that was created 100 years ago or 150 years ago by a legal. So you got to undo that, and I don't know how you do it. It's actually unimaginable to think that could stop, but it will.
But it's becoming like, aside from the global pollution levels or the profiteering that is like out of control, there are more tangible human to human reasons why we are seeing like governments and their inability to respond and regulate these things becoming like more divisive on the ground level. And I say that being like, I've never seen people more like riled up and have less faith in governments than today. And like you look at the CRTC, taking I don't know how long to finally get to the point where they were saying yes, Netflix is actually a television channel or whatever you want to call it, to be able to say they're going to tax it and regulate it, and that the Canadian content has to be in there. And like, so streaming platforms are now in that. But I mean, it took like 7 or 8 years for them to get to that point. Did anybody think when they were turning on Netflix and they're flicking through things that it was different than television and DVR? Like, that's just ridiculous. It's just content coming to you in a different format. The same with like Uber and taxis. Like, no, it's not a taxi. This is a different thing. I'm like, don't use corporate and legal loopholes to circumvent the systems of our governments, which we put in place to protect us from these exact things. Like, it's unbelievable how much of this is happening on a global level. Like right now, Google and Facebook are in fights with the Australian government in regards to whether or not content that is produced is news on those sites, because they're social media in general. But they have the same advertising revenue that they've just stripped the entire news sector of, but then they have no accountability of what's happening. So if I posted hate speech in a newspaper, not only would the newspaper be fined heavily for doing that, I would be charged for that. But if I post hate speech on Facebook, first of all, they may or may not be able to even take it down because they have their own ways of doing things. But second, there's no accountability for them that allowing me to do that. I can't handle that. That's not healthy for me. Our governments need to be able to regulate these things, because that's the people we elected to put in place. Corporations, I didn't vote for any of those people to run that, right? Like, democracy has to kind of take a step up right now, or whatever, that new generation is going to do it for us.
Let's end a bit on hope, because it's a word that I've been struggling with, because it can be a bit glib to say I am hopeful, to be optimistic maybe. But just yesterday I was reading an article by Rebecca Solnit, who wrote in The Guardian about how there are actually some things that are changing rapidly. Decrease in use of oil and gas and new technologies, and new technologies are not going to save the world, but the accumulated efforts of millions of people and system change can create, we talk about uncertainty, but uncertainty can go both ways, right? It can go negative, it can go positive. And there's something very joyful about thinking about, a positive outcome, because it's been so dark when you get into the data, and the data is uninterpreted. It's just straight out data from scientists. They're doing their job. They're telling us what's happening. Cultural workers need to interpret that. And as you said, create a vision that is positive for the future and is, not only livable, because that's not good enough, is a full life, a complete life. What does that look like?
Well, and yeah, I'm very so, like, in the same side of me constantly saying how I am optimistic and I'm on that side of things. But I mean, the counter narrative to that is the drama, right? Like the two masks of theater being like comedy and tragedy. And I think that arts are constantly those two narratives, right? Like, I tend to sway towards the proactive, but I also see the value in the tragedy and exemplifying the negative, because we need to have both those messages in order to be able to choose that path. So there's a part of me that thinks the discourse in the arts being that, many messages, but primarily, like, both very positive and showing the pathway, but also showing, like, where this could go, and having that dark side, I think can make clear choices for people about, like, why we're not, making fast food containers out of styrofoam anymore. And now moving forward, I'm like, how can everything just become a little bit more like, oh, you're going to go to a restaurant and buy takeout food because you've got the standardized takeout containers that you brought with you that are there for life, right? Like, how can we just change behavior on a more holistic level and have it stick, because that's what we need to do right now. And I think the arts would be a great vehicle to see that those messages really hit everybody and make a change.
Thank you very much. We'll talk again.
Thank you so much for having me on this show. It's an honor.